Bioventix is involved in blood testing. So this is our sphere of operation. Blood testing takes place in hospitals and clinics around the world where blood samples are taken from patients looking like that, and they're trafficked to blood testing machines where blood samples are robotically analysed by large automated machines. And these machines are manufactured by large multinational companies such as Roche, Siemens, Abbott Laboratories, Beckman Coulter. So these machines are able to analyse blood samples for a variety of different things to do with healthcare issues such as heart disease, thyroid disease, fertility, infectious disease, cancer, etc. And within each disease area, there would be a suite of tests that the robot is able to operate tests on, depending on what's been requested for the blood sample. Each individual test that the machine can perform is supported by a reagent pack. And in the reagent pack, there will be an antibody, which is this green Y-shaped molecule here. And the antibody that's interesting, that's gone adrift as well. So the antibody is designed to bind to an individual antigen, which is what the blood's been tested for. And the antibody starts life in this reagent pack without the target, so it's a naked antibody. When the robot performs a test, it mixes some reagent from the reagent pack containing the antibody with a sample of blood, and then a binding event takes place where the antibody finds the hormone or whatever it is in the blood, and the binding event is then detected by the blood testing machine and then quantified. So that's how the blood testing machines work. What we do in our little laboratory in Farnham in Surrey is that we create and manufacture antibodies and then sell them to blood testing companies around the world, such as Abbott, Roche, Siemens, and Beckman Coulter. And we do this in the hope that our antibodies that we can create and manufacture will facilitate improved blood tests on these testing machines around the world. And we sell around 20 grams of antibody a year, which equates to around a heaped tablespoonful. Although it's in liquid form, and it would probably equate to something like 5 or 6 litres so probably 2 or 3 of those per annum. And that supports our annual revenue. So that's essentially Bioventix's business. Crucial to the financial performance of our business is that when we sell our antibodies, we sell these antibodies in liquid form to our customers, and we charge them per milligram. But we also have a downstream chargeable event that's part of our pricing mechanism, which is that whilst we sell physical antibody to make a physical reagent pack, when this reagent pack then gets used downstream with, for example, Siemens selling a reagent pack for some testosterone tests to my hospital in Guildford for, say, £100, we subsequently get a small share of that downstream transaction. And that downstream transaction we call a royalty, and it catapults our financial dynamics. So that's Bioventix and what we do. Over the last 20 years, since the lab has been creating and manufacturing antibodies, we've made 20 or so different antibodies for use on these blood testing machines. The most important for us is an antibody for vitamin D deficiency testing, which we sell to many companies. But we've also made a number of antibodies for thyroid function testing, thyroxine or T4, T3, and TSH is another thyroid hormone. We're very strong in fertility hormone testing, such as testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, and cortisol, all important in not just female biology, but male biology as well. A growing area for us is heart disease testing, and in particular troponin, which is a component of heart muscle that leaks out of the heart when you've had a heart attack and can be detected in blood. We also have a small interest in blood testing, in drug testing as well. So we the majority of the antibodies that we've created and that we sell are done under our own initiative and our own resources and our own know-how, and we sell them to a variety of companies. We also have some contract research where blood testing companies will pay us to create antibodies for use on their machines only, and troponin is an example of that. The way the dynamics of our business works is that at some stage, someone has an idea to do something useful, to create a new antibody for a new blood test or an improved old blood test. And it might be our own idea, or it might be a sponsored idea from a customer or a customer initiative. And then we operate our antibody technology whereby we create something to immunize our sheep. And the sheep will then respond to that, making an antibody to whatever we've immunized the sheep with. And then you get sheep white blood cells out of the sheep, and through some various technologies, these can then be cloned and cultured to then create your antibodies for subsequent use. And it takes us around a year to create these small samples of antibodies for then use at our customers. So that takes us about a year. And then the next step in the process is at our customers' laboratories and at our customers' research labs. They'll take small quantities of our antibodies and in a research setting, formulate a small prototype reagent pack using a guest antibody that we've FedEx, and it would be a tiny sample of a few mils that they can then use equivalent manufacturing techniques to their commercial manufacturing friends to create a small reagent pack for prototyping. What they then can do is to retrieve frozen blood samples from their freezers and in the blood testing machines in the research setting, compare a prototype using a guest antibody from us or from someone else or one of their own, and then compare it to an existing test or a gold standard test to get a comparison of the two prototypes, or the prototype and the sales or gold standard, which may or may not convince them that the prototype is an improvement or not. If it is an improvement and it has commercial merit, then it will progress towards development and marketing approval. And this process here would require very little support from us, apart from maybe additional physical supplies of physical antibody. But it's quite an arduous process for the customer to then formulate a team that involves the manufacturing, marketing, quality assurance, regulatory affairs, field trial people to create the data required to take this prototype through to regulatory approval. The obvious point here being that, similar to the people at Eden, these processes are highly regulated. In order to sell a blood test at a hospital to detect a heart attack, the machine and the reagent pack must have marketing approval from the local regulatory authority. So it would take quite a considerable amount of resource and time for our customers. And unlike Eden, we don't actually get involved in this process. All we do is supply reagents. Our customers go through this arduous approval process, which takes a number of years to get approval. And there are a couple of implications of this on our little business. The first of which is that the lead time between us having hopefully intelligent ideas to make antibodies and it delivering any form of revenue is a number of years, and I typically say 5 years. And that's an impediment to, or a brake on the growth of our business, and it's a fact of life that we cannot change, and if anything, it's getting slightly worse. The other implication of the second line here is that after a customer has gone through this process, hopefully with your antibody, and they've got marketing approval for a new blood test or a revised blood test that's an improvement, they will be very reluctant to repeat this process with another antibody that's cheaper or doesn't have a royalty. And therefore, if one is involved in this process and you've succeeded in playing your part in getting a blood test approved that contains your antibody and you're able to sell it and get a royalty on it, then you're unlikely to be displaced by that customer in the future, and unless it turns out there's some Achilles heel that no one foresaw at the start, in which case this process would be revisited. The obvious point being that the approval process is very specific to the reagents and in particular the antibody. And if you change the antibody, you need to go back not necessarily to Old Kent Road, but certainly to the first part of the board to repeat substantial parts of this approval process. And so that's why we have an impediment of revenue growth because it takes a long time, but we do have a high degree of revenue continuity from the natural inertia of the second line. We're a small lab in Farnham of 12 people, and we have significant revenues measured. So this is the year ending last summer was almost 13 million pounds. We've only got a few million pounds worth of costs, so clearly that delivers a highly profitable business. We transfer quite a lot of money to Jeremy Hunt in the form of corporation tax because he needs it. And we generate a lot of cash that we then distribute to our loyal shareholders, such as Bruce, in the form of dividends. And so last year we distributed £1.50 per share, which equates to something like, you know this better than me, like 3 or 4%, something like that, Bruce, in terms of depending on the share price. And the share price is actually largely driven by the cash generation rather than anything else I do. So, and that being the case, as some of you may know, corporation tax is going up or has gone up, and was likely to stay that way. So that will affect our net cash generation in the future. So that's our financial dynamics for last year. In terms of the individual antibodies, the vitamin D antibody has been a great success for us and is used by a number of companies around the world for vitamin D deficiency testing. So it's grown quite a lot, and last year grew by 7% over the previous year. Troponin is the one that's been growing quite steadily or more significantly if compared to vitamin D, and it's growing. It's forecast to continue to grow quite healthily over the coming years. Then we have a suite of other antibodies which we made many years ago for thyroid testing and for steroid testing. And they all form a portfolio of quite mature antibody products that have been sold for many years and will continue to do well as our business expands, partly in the West, but also in China. So those are the different antibodies that we've sold over the years. In terms of the year ending last July, we sold physical products, did well. We have a growing business in China as indigenous Chinese companies are getting involved with what has historically been a Western business activity through Abbott, Roche and Siemens. But we are doing quite well with some of those Chinese companies, although it's fair to say that there are issues with China. Clearly, the plus point is that it's a big growth market for healthcare. But on the other side of the coin, there is intense competition in all parts of healthcare, including antibody technology, and clearly that will have an impact on everybody in the West in the years to come. Our vitamin D antibodies continue to do well, and troponin's grown significantly, and so last year was a good year for us. Into the future, we have created antibodies that we think might be useful in the future. I'm only going to really talk about one today because I think it's by far the most interesting and potentially valuable is Alzheimer's disease. I'm not going to mention any of this because this is much more interesting. Alzheimer's disease, you're all familiar with it because I suspect everybody in the room will know someone somewhere in their family that has suffered from Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to try and summarize 20-30 years of research into Alzheimer's disease in one PowerPoint slide, which is a little bit of an insult to the people that have been part of that work, but I'm going to do it anyway. So biologically, what happens in Alzheimer's disease is you get a couple of things happening at a cellular level. You get these amyloid plaques that build up outside the nerve cells or neurons. And you get these tau tangles that build up inside. So amyloid A and T tau. What that then appears as macroscopically through scanning techniques is essentially a shrinking or shriveling of the brain, where you get these ventricles and gaps appear in the shrunken brain. So brain mass is reduced as it shrinks, as you lose neurons through neurodegeneration process. And this phase is called neurodegeneration. Depressingly, if you're on this pathway, or this disease pathway, it starts many years, 10 or 20 years prior to getting to this point of being symptomatic. So you're talking about 10 or 20 years when the amyloid deposition process starts, then the tau tangles form, then you get neurodegeneration. That is before this point here, which is disease onset. So it's a long disease process, and when it starts, it continues. The development of the disease can be tracked through PET scans, and they're PET scans which have an additional tracer which binds to either the amyloid or the tau, so that you can visualize it using these PET scanners. And this is the way it looks as the disease progresses. So you can see the amyloid part of the disease progression as the brain lights up with these amyloid deposits, and this happens early on. And then later, using a separate tau tracer, again using exactly the same brain scanning technology, but with a different tracer, you can see the tau deposition. And then later on, then you can essentially see this part of the disease process using MRI scanners, and you can see almost exactly so picture for picture what happens between a healthy brain, and you see these ventricle holes that enlarge in a diseased brain. Now that is all pretty depressing, but in September 2022, the landscape changed when Eisai Biogen announced results of a phase 3 study showing that an antibody-based drug succeeded in removing these plaques from Alzheimer's patients, which reversed these amyloid PET scans, which is remarkable biologically, but also, crucially, the angle of neurological decline was changed. And it was the first time ever a disease-modifying therapeutic had been observed in Alzheimer's disease. So that was September 2022, and then later in March 2023, Eli Lilly announced that donanemab, another drug that does the same thing of removing these amyloid plaques, also changed the angle of decline of neurodegeneration. So this whole landscape of Alzheimer's has changed. Clearly, we're not involved in therapeutics, so it's not relevant to us. But what is interesting, and what I think will happen in the future, is that as Alzheimer's therapeutics become more common and established as part of routine healthcare, there will be a requirement for two forms of diagnostics that will be, in our little world, blockbuster products. And those will be two things. First of all, assays or tests which will enable you to screen for people who are at this early stage here, this early amyloid phase here, or this phase here, which during the course of clinical trials you can do with PET scans at a cost of thousands of pounds. Well, if you're familiar with the pharmaceutical industry and what it costs to do clinical trials, a few £1,000s for a PET scan is nothing. But as a routine screening tool for people of my age to work out whether they're on the path of Alzheimer's, thousands of pounds for an annual scan is not something that any healthcare provider would be able to sustain. Whereas a cheap blood test could form part of a 5-year screen, and I think that's something that could happen in the future. And when people are on therapy, these therapies will be expensive. They will need to be monitored. They're a bit like type 1 diabetes, type 1 or type 2. You'd need diagnostic tests to screen for people who have got the disease and for tests that monitor people who are on therapy. And both those exist for type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And I think the same would exist for patients on these new Alzheimer's therapy. So people who are screened as candidates of therapy, then test for monitoring people whilst they're on therapy. And the way that could be done is possibly through expensive brain scans. But if you had blood tests that mirrored the results of the brain scans, they would be cheaper, much more efficient, and susceptible to mass usage, whereas clearly PET scans aren't, because there aren't enough PET scanners to do what they're designed to do right now. So that's what we're embarking on, or what we've been involved with 3 or 4 or 5 years now, is developing blood tests that do these things would enable early screening of patients and monitoring patients on therapy. Which is what this essentially says, is that I think the diagnostic potential is things that detect amyloid at the early stage and neurodegeneration later. Obviously, we're a little company in Farnham, and there's actually no way that we could participate in this field without a bit of help. And as I think it's good fortune, or somehow it worked out that we've got involved with one of the leaders globally in this field of blood-based testing for Alzheimer's disease at the University of Gothenburg, where we've established a collaboration whereby we've made antibodies for use, and they've got testing machines and have been able to set up prototype tests to do just this, to look for these early screen tests and for biomonitoring tests. I'm not going to talk through this other than the fact that we've made some progress with our friends in Gothenburg, and it now features in the scientific press, and so the peer-reviewed publications showing that prototype tests that they have established using our antibodies do work pretty well in early screening, and work quite well in monitoring people for neurodegeneration. So we're quite excited about this as being something that we're involved with now and is going okay, and could contribute to hopefully us being involved in this field in the 2030s, supplying antibodies for use in these diagnostic tests. And I think about the 2030s as being the time frame by which healthcare providers around the world will get their heads around the provision of these therapeutics and the diagnostics and the other medical machinery that would be required to manage patients going through this journey. This is kind of basically saying I think it's going to take a long time for markets to develop. There will be some research use that will be modest, but actually from our point of view, it's quite simple really. It's about getting involved in people with our existing customers who are interested in blood testing, who perceive this as being a blockbuster area for diagnostics in the 2030s, and getting involved with them. And that's what we're doing right now. What's our strategy? Well, we have an existing business that we need to sustain going forwards. We're also interested in new biomarkers and new diagnostics of the future, such as tau and the Alzheimer's project. In actual fact, the reality of our little business is that these things don't come along very often. So the things that I've talked about with vitamin D deficiency, heart attack testing, Alzheimer's testing, these opportunities come along every few years, and we have to wait patiently for those to arrive. But that's kind of part of our strategy, to wait patiently and execute when it happens. We have some other interesting technologies which are involved in testing for industrial chemicals. So, for example, if somebody said, "Oh, there's an insecticide," and we want to sort of have a lateral flow test that would work in a field, then that's the kind of thing that we could do. And we've used this technology for marijuana or THC testing, and that's something we're trying to think of areas where our antibody technology, which is exquisitely designed for measuring trace small molecules at low levels in agricultural products or saliva or water or whatever, that we can use our technology for. And any ideas that you have, just email me, because we could do with some. These are our labs in Farnham. So we've got labs for culturing sheep cells to make our sheep antibodies. We've got these bioreactors for mass producing our 20 grams of antibody a year. Purify the antibodies on this kind of equipment, and here's a technology development lab. So that's what our antibodies look like. That's me, and Ian's our chairman. He's been around for a number of years. Bruce, the FD, Nick and Joe, non-executive directors. That's the team. Shareholding. There's a variety of people. Some people you might have heard of. Fairly well established. Quite a reasonable quality of investors that we've got through our friends at Cavendish, formerly FinCap. So yeah, I mean, where we are right now is that our historical business has done quite well in terms of sales development, sales and profit and dividends, and we're quite excited how troponin's growing to add to the existing historic portfolio, and I think tau and Alzheimer's is a very exciting area for the 2030s that we hope to be involved with. Break. But any questions before break?
Yes, absolutely. Questions, please.
Yeah. The customer-sponsored work that you're doing, is that revenue generating for you, or how does that model? I'm more interested in how the model works, because it's an interesting idea. We've had a very similar scenario with the seed treatment that I was talking about earlier. So I'm just kind of curious as to whether or how you monetize it.
Well, it's all back-ended, so you might cover your costs or make a small margin from contract R&D. So we might charge, say, $100,000 to spend a year to create some antibodies that we ship back to Siemens or Roche or Abbott, and then they will still take another 5 years to develop a test on which you would then apply a royalty. So it works, but it's still quite a long process. Before you get your share in the benefit in the final product, which you've contributed towards. So if you're impatient, it's kind of not that desirable. But if you've got time, then it's great to build a pipeline of things. My view is that if you're involved with a good partner and a good project, then it doesn't. And if it's sponsored, then that's great. And you've got a customer that presumably is enthusiastic. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent $100,000 to enable you to do what you've done.
How important is it that you develop this Alzheimer's test? That do you need to be the only player in the market? Can you have multiple competitors and still have plenty of revenues flowing off it?
I think the solution will be all about the providers of the equipment and the test, and that's most likely to be the established diagnostics companies with machines on the ground in hospitals and clinics around the world. So I think it will be dominated by Abbott, Roche, Siemens, Beckman, etc., etc. So I think it will be dominated by those big companies. It's possible that some of the research-orientated machines will still have a part to play, such as Quanterix and Alamar, and there's a few others. We're just an antibody supplier, so I think for us it's about sowing seeds with those companies and hope that they choose our antibodies, and because they work on their platform slightly better than other antibodies. And as soon as we get our antibodies involved in those tests with those partner companies, then our position is sort of quite well anchored for the 2030s.
Question at the back, and then I'm going to set Tim on.
You didn't specifically mention patents. Presumably your protection is it's very difficult to get into the market with your product. But is there anything to stop somebody, in effect, reverse engineering an antibody once they know that it works?
Well, you make a very good and painful point, which is that it's reverse engineering is increasingly easy, but also whilst we've been around for 20 years, antibody technology has raced ahead. And so whilst 20 years ago, I think our technology was quite special, I think that's less so now. So there is a lot more antibody technology competition, full stop. So I think the ability of people not just to copy our antibodies, to make better ones, than our older antibodies. That is much more of the reality of being in 2024. What protects our historic business is that it's still a bit of an annoyance, or more than that, for someone to change an antibody, even if it's a bit better. If you've got something that works really well, and I kind of use the BMW 3 Series engine management system as an example. There might be a Chinese variant that's slightly better, but would BMW strip out the Robert Bosch variant because it's a little bit more expensive? And it's quite a risky thing to do because save a few euros. So, and because this is all regulated, switching antibodies is something that people would reluctantly do. So I think our historic business is quite well protected through this immense inertia of continual use. For the future and new projects like tau and Alzheimer's, well, that's a bit more of a blank sheet of paper, and we're going into bat making antibodies to tau against people with 2024 technology, and we're still a little bit 1980s, but we kind of do things to improve and compete as best we can. So I'm kind of, competition is an issue, particularly for new projects. That's kind of more of a direct threat if compared to the historic core business, which I think has immensely sort of continuity, which is not total, but it's pretty good.
Peter, you mentioned lateral flow tests right at the end. Do I assume from that none of your current product, or at least not much of your current product, actually ends up in lateral flow tests? Second part to that question is, with the Alzheimer's development, I would have thought now the public around the world are very familiar with lateral flow tests. Do you think that might actually present a bigger opportunity, lateral flow tests for consumers, than the in-hospital testing for monitoring the disease?
Okay, two questions. I think lateral flow is something also we're not involved with, we haven't historically not been involved with at all. It's all been due, so all the testing's done at hospitals, and the machines are at Abbott, Roche, Siemens, Beck and Ortho, and we just make, we just sell liquid antibodies. So we've not historically not been involved at all. But over the last few years, we have got involved in a final product testing for industrial pollutants, pyrene and benzene and polyurethanes. We're kind of getting involved with that. So we have kind of like got our toe in the water of lateral flow, because it suits a particular antibody technology for small molecules that we are quite exquisitely good at. I'm not sure if any of the things that we've done so far are going to be big, but if someone said, if you were to test for this on seeds or crops or something like that, and it would be every farmer in the world would be doing it, I'd be quite interested. So I think lateral flow is a part of
and specifically for Alzheimer's testing.
I think the issue with Alzheimer's is that I think the most likely scenario is that for routine screening, people in their sort of 60s, 70s, and maybe 80s will get screened every 5 years, a routine blood test, and you'll have a white, a grey, and a black zone. Black zone means that you're almost definitely on the pathway. Grey zone would mean that you probably need a confirmatory PET scan. And white means that you're good for 5 years, come back in 5 years' time. And the boundaries between those would need to be exquisitely precise. And lateral flow, I don't think, would ever deliver that. So I think the test will be doctor, hospital, clinic, memory clinic based, and not go to Boots and check yourself out.
So sort of more quantitative than qualitative.
Precision will be the key on those tests.
A small question from a very happy shareholder. Your share used to be my smallest, it's now my biggest, but that's life. The thing that worries me is the vulnerability of production. Is your laboratory area properly insured? How quickly could you rebuild it? Because you're very vulnerable.
We have a disaster recovery plan that involves a number of things. Cloning the facility, which would take 1 to 2 years. I mean, we're insured, but if I ring up my customers and say, jumbo jets landed on our lab in Farnham, but we're insured, the customers say, well, how about us? So the way I deal with that is to advise thinking customers store a year or two's worth of product. And some do that anyway because they are foresighted. you do have some customers that get McKinsey in, and McKinsey will say, oh, destock, 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 working capital, and people that operate like that, I just think should fire the McKinsey people and listen to themselves. My daughter works for McKinsey, so I've got to be a little bit careful because she might see this on the internet. But also, we hold stocks of the cells off-site at Porton Down. I've also got about 1 to 2 years worth of stock frozen at minus 80 degrees C in my garage next to my E-Type. And I look after that garage for obvious reasons.
Peter. You say it's a 5-year process from concept to commercialization. So you're 3 or 4 years down with Tau, and there'll be others that are probably doing antibodies as well in the Tau space. Do you know how developed they are and how much of a march you've got over anybody else? And are Gothenburg using anybody else's antibodies?
Me perceiving there to be a blockbuster for Alzheimer's diagnostics in the 2030s is not just a personal view. Other people have twigged that as well. And the September 2022 was a breakthrough moment where actually other people have perceived that in advance, that all these things could work. So people have been working on Tau for much longer than we have. So there are lots of other antibodies. There are antibodies that are using 2024 technology. So yeah, there's a lot of competition. I think we'll get an idea during this year and next year with our various interactions. We're sending samples out to customers, say, try this, try that. This one works in Gothenburg on clinical samples, delivers good results. That's influential. So there's quite a complex shakeout, but it is competitive. And there are lots of antibodies around, not just ours. Ours are good. I already know ours are good, but there's a lot of competition. So we'll find out how that shakes out, 2024, 2025. But I think later in the 2020s, it will be quite clear what value that we would hopefully will be part of a value chain in the 2030s.
So if you were a gambler, how much will you place? What are the odds of this actually getting to commercialization?
I would say that revenue generation from our Tau portfolio is definite. We will get revenue from our Tau portfolio. As to whether it's 10 grand a year, 100 grand a year, $1 million a year, or 10 million a year, well, there's a few orders of magnitude in there, and I couldn't comment on that right now. But keep it to ask the same question next year.
I promise this is a quick question, so can you please make it a quick answer?
For people that have not invested in Bioventix, what's the case of investing now?
Well, that's something that I tend not to advise, and I try and sort of focus on value generation and then just let the rest of it sort itself out. I'm not an analyst, I'm a scientist, so I kind of let other people make up their own minds on that. The professional investors, they go through Cavendish and they look at research notes, and they may be influenced by that. Some people like ratios. There are other groups of people that do other forms of research, Bruce, and talk amongst themselves. They come to their own decision. So I try, and I'm not an expert on company valuation. I do antibodies and try and stick to it. I do own, my share portfolio is quite narrow. And would I sell Bioventix to buy anything else?
Well, you did sell some.
I did sell some, yeah. I've sold, that's only to buy property though, so not to buy shares.
A question that I'm always asked to put is there any cash raise in the offing, and is there if so, is there a role for individual investor?
We're cash generating, so we distribute quite a lot of surplus cash to our loyal shareholders, of which there's a couple here. So we have no need to raise cash whatsoever. A sort of sexy M&A spree is not something that I'm that keen on, and I know the shareholders don't like the idea of getting risky. So we've got for a high-tech business, it's quite risk-free, and a lot of people quite like that. As to whether it's good value for money, I don't know. I can't comment on that.
Super. Peter, thank you very much indeed.